We've talked about how you can have certain pieces of code inside of other pieces of code. For example, you can have loops inside of functions, and loops inside of loops, and arrays inside of arrays, and on and on and on, right? But interestingly enough, you can also have functions inside of functions. These are called nested functions, and they look something like this. So what we have here is a simple function named do something. And inside of that function is an echo call, and after that, another function named do a second thing. Inside of that function, we have yet another echo call, and another function named do a third thing. And finally, inside of that function, we have the last echo call. Now let's start calling these functions, and whilst we do that, I'm going to turn on the error reporting so you can get a glimpse behind the scenes of the fantastic world of weirdo code. Okay, so let's call the first function. Now, before we look at the output, what do we expect to see? Well, nowhere in our call to the first function is a call to the second or third functions, right? The same is true for inside of the functions. There are no calls to the other functions. So in this case, we should only see the first echo statement, right? Okay. Good. And that's exactly what happens. And no errors. Now, let's call the second function. Oh, fatal error. Call to undefined function. We've got a problem. PHP is basically telling us that we're calling a function that doesn't exist. But there it is. Odd. Okay, let's call the third function. And again, fatal error, call to undefined function. Okay, so what's going on here? I don't want to tell you yet. Hold on. Watch what happens when I do this. All right, let's call our first function again, and then let's call the second function. Okay, very interesting. No errors, and both functions were called. It seems that somehow that missing function is suddenly not so missing. Okay, so let's call the first function and then the third function. Oh, wait, no, we're back to an error again. Are you starting to see the pattern here? Let's do one more test and maybe you'll see the odd behavior for what it is. Let's call the first function, then the second function, then the third function. And we get no errors. All those missing functions have been found, and all of them were called and produced an output. So again, what in the HE double toothpicks is going on here? Well, the PHP engine, here's the answer, okay? The PHP engine, that's the server that's holding and performing all of your PHP code, has something called a parser. Okay. Basically, what's happening on the server computer is that PHP engine is reading all of your PHP code on your page and parsing it or translating it into machine code and then performing all of the tasks that you told it to perform. Now, whilst the parser is doing this job, one of the things that it does is to build the functions that it sees. Okay. And here's the crucial part. It only builds the functions that are actually called. So if you have somewhere in your code a function that you've written, but you never actually call it, PHP doesn't build it. It doesn't exist to PHP, which is fine because you didn't call it anyway, right? But when you have a nested function, something similar happens. Let's take an example of calling the second function only. So we're trying to call the second function, but because our first function was never called, the first function was not built by the parser. And because the second function lives inside of the first function, the second function doesn't exist either. And hence the error undefined function. Now, when we call the first function first and then call the second function, we're okay, right? The parser built the first function because we called it. And it then builds the second function, nested function, because we also called that. The same thing happens with the third function. If we only call the third function, the function doesn't exist because we never called the second function, which houses it. But even if we had called the second function, that function doesn't exist because we never called the first function which houses that. Have I lost you? Does this make sense? I don't know. I wonder. Anyway, here's the gist. Nested functions. Don't do it. Okay? The way that you call a nested function is the same way that you call any other function, so just keep all your functions at the root level, period. Okay? Until PHP changes things and actually makes it viable or even preferable to nest functions for some reason that I can't think of at the moment, just don't nest functions. Hey, this is Scotty from CodePanic, and this was just a tiny snippet of my web application masterclass series. If you're interested in increasing your skill set, staying ahead of the coming AI wave, and learning to build web-based applications, check out my web application masterclass series over at codepanic.tv. I know you're going to like what you see.